Over the years, Tansy Fernbrook had rescued a great many foolish creatures from Miller's Creek. Ducks who'd misjudged the current, a sheep who'd wandered onto ice too thin to hold her, and, memorably, the goat Constable Biscuit, who had once attempted to fight his own reflection in the water and lost spectacularly. In all her 22 years tending the hillside flock her grandmother left her, she had never rescued anything quite like the enormous black wolf drowning in the swollen creek behind her house, one leg hopelessly trapped in submerged roots, golden eyes wide with panic. "Oh, for goodness sake," Tansy muttered, already wading in boots first. "Hold still, you enormous idiot, or we're both going under." The wolf did not hold still. In one panicked moment, he very nearly took her hand off, but exhaustion finally won out, and he went limp enough for her to drag him, inch by freezing inch, onto the muddy bank. She barely slept that night, keeping watch over the enormous, unconscious creature sprawled across her kitchen floor. But when exhaustion finally hit, she fell into a deep sleep. Tansy woke at dawn to find the wolf gone. In his place, tangled in her second-best quilt and taking up considerably more space in her narrow bed than any guest properly should, was a man, dark-haired, golden-eyed, and judging by the crown-shaped birthmark she absolutely was not supposed to be noticing on his bare shoulder, considerably more important than a stray dog. She didn't know who this man was, and even less did she know that he marked the first of many chaotic days yet to come. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The kitchen door did not survive Constable Biscuit's solidarity headbutt, so much as it surrendered entirely, swinging off one hinge with a groan that startled the man in Tansy's bed considerably more than her scream had. "What?" said the man, sitting bolt upright and clutching her second-best quilt to his bare chest, with the particular affronted dignity of someone who had absolutely no idea where he was or why a goat had just assaulted a door, "is happening?" "That," Tansy said, pointing at the goat currently attempting to back up for a second charge, "is Constable Biscuit. He has opinions about screaming. You are currently in my bed, wearing my grandmother's quilt, and you were, as of last night, a wolf." The man blinked at her. "Golden eyes," she noted distantly, entirely too golden for an ordinary person, though at this particular moment she was considerably more distracted by the fact that he appeared to be wearing nothing beneath the quilt whatsoever. "I was a wolf," he repeated slowly, as though testing the sentence for accuracy. "You were drowning in my creek. I pulled you out. You bled all over my second-best rug, slept on my kitchen floor for approximately 6 hours, and then apparently decided, sometime before dawn, to become a considerably larger problem." Tansy crossed her arms, refusing to properly look anywhere below his collarbone. "I'd like an explanation, please, before Constable Biscuit finishes what he started with my door." The explanation, once the man had been sufficiently distracted from further staring by the offer of actual clothing, an old shirt and trousers that had belonged to her late grandfather, considerably too small across the shoulders but sufficient for basic decency, proved rather more complicated than Tansy had properly braced herself for. "I'm King Vesper Nightshade," he said, settling at her kitchen table with the particular awkward stiffness of a man unused to sitting on furniture not built for royalty. "Of the Nightshade territory. I was traveling incognito through these hills when a rival pack ambushed my party. I shifted to escape, ran considerably further than intended, and apparently misjudged a creek crossing rather badly." "You're a king." "I am. You're a king who nearly drowned in Miller's Creek." "Miller's Creek. The creek Constable Biscuit fell into last spring trying to fight a stick. I confess I wasn't previously aware of the creek's full reputation," Vesper said, something dry entering his voice despite his evident exhaustion. "Though I'll admit it's given me considerably more trouble than several actual battles." Duchess, the elderly sheep who had wandered in sometime during the night to sleep beside her unconscious guest, chose that exact moment to let out a long, wheezing bleat from her spot by the hearth, entirely unbothered by the revelation that royalty currently occupied the kitchen. "Even your sheep seems skeptical," Vesper observed. "Duchess is skeptical of everything. She once spent an entire afternoon glaring at a scarecrow." Tansy set a cup of tea in front of him, mostly because it gave her hands something to do besides fidget. "So, a king, being hunted by a rival pack, in my kitchen, wearing my dead grandfather's trousers. When you phrase it that way, it does sound rather more absurd than the situation properly warrants." "I don't think there's a phrasing that makes this sound less absurd, Your Majesty." Sir Quacksworth chose that moment to waddle in through the ruined doorway, take one long judgmental look at the stranger occupying his household's kitchen table, and let out a series of increasingly aggressive quacks that Tansy had, over 3 years of duck ownership, learned to interpret as "I do not like this, and I would like everyone to know it." "Your duck appears to share Constable Biscuit's opinion of me," Vesper said. "Sir Quacksworth doesn't like anyone new. It took him 4 months to properly accept the mail carrier, and that was after the mail carrier started bringing him stale bread as tribute." Tansy settled into the chair across from him, exhaustion from the previous night's rescue finally catching up with her properly. "You said a rival pack ambushed you. Are they still out there? Should I be expecting more chaos on top of the chaos currently occupying my kitchen?" Something serious crossed Vesper's face, the earlier awkward humor fading into genuine concern. "Possibly. I don't know how far they pursued me or whether they tracked my scent this far. I should leave properly before I bring danger to your doorstep alongside the inconvenience I've already caused." "You can barely stand up straight, Your Majesty. I watched you nearly collapse walking from the bedroom to this table." Tansy gestured at his considerably battered condition, the still healing scrapes along one arm, the exhausted slump of his shoulders despite his best effort at royal composure. "You're not going anywhere until you're properly recovered, rival pack or no rival pack. I didn't drag you out of that creek just to watch you collapse in my front yard from sheer stubbornness." Vesper studied her for a long moment, something considering in his golden gaze. "You're remarkably unbothered by housing a king, for someone who apparently had no idea what she was pulling out of that creek. I've pulled considerably more inconvenient things out of that creek than a king, honestly. Sir Reginald the Ram once got himself wedged beneath a fallen log for 3 hours because he was convinced it was a rival ram he needed to properly intimidate. Compared to that particular rescue, you were rather straightforward." That surprised a genuine laugh out of him, short, rusty, clearly unused to the sensation given how quickly he seemed to catch himself afterward. "I don't believe I've been compared to a stubborn ram before." "There's a first time for everything, Your Majesty." The morning passed in a strange domestic blur, Tansy tending her flock's usual needs while keeping half an eye on her unexpected guest, who insisted, despite her protests, on attempting to help with chores he clearly had no proper experience performing. "You're doing that wrong," she informed him, watching him attempt to fill the water trough with considerably more enthusiasm than technique, half the bucket's contents ending up on his borrowed trousers rather than in the trough itself. "I'm a king. I don't typically fill troughs." "Clearly." She took the bucket from him with practiced ease. "Sit down before you drown yourself a second time in 1 week. That would be considerably embarrassing for royal record-keeping, I imagine." Constable Biscuit, apparently deciding he'd sufficiently punished the door for the morning's earlier disturbance, wandered over to investigate the newcomer with the particular thorough curiosity goats brought to literally everything, headbutting Vesper's leg experimentally before losing interest and wandering off to eat a nearby fence post instead. "Your goat just assessed me and found me unremarkable," Vesper observed, something amused entering his tired voice. Constable Biscuit finds everything unremarkable except food and his own reflection. Don't take it personally. They settled into an easy rhythm as the morning wore on. Vesper gradually relaxing from his initial stiff, formal bearing into something considerably more genuine, occasionally offering dry commentary about her animal's various personalities that made Tansy laugh more than she'd properly expected from a king currently recovering from near drowning in her modest kitchen. "That one," he said, nodding toward Duchess, who had settled into a particularly sunny patch of grass with the boneless satisfaction of a creature who considered napping her primary life's purpose. "Seems to have opinions about absolutely nothing at all." Duchess has strong opinions. She simply expresses them exclusively through extremely pointed napping locations. If she's sleeping in your usual chair, that's a message. "What message, precisely?" "That you've displeased her, and she intends to inconvenience you about it indefinitely." Vesper's answering laugh was warmer this time, less rusty, and Tansy found herself, watching him properly relax into her odd little farm's rhythm, considerably less unsettled by his royal status than the morning's dramatic reveal had initially suggested she should be. It was near midday, sharing a simple lunch of bread and cheese on her cottage's front step, that Vesper finally addressed the question that had been quietly hovering between them since breakfast. "I should properly thank you," he said, "for pulling me from that creek. I've considered more than once this morning exactly how differently last night might have ended without your intervention." "You're welcome, though I confess I'd have pulled anyone out of that creek, king or otherwise. It's rather become my particular hobby, apparently, hauling foolish creatures out of dangerous water. I notice you've placed me in the same category as your goat and your ram. You very nearly drowned in the same creek Sir Reginald once got stuck in fighting a log. I'd say the category's fairly earned, Your Majesty." That earned another genuine laugh, and something in his expression watching her carried a warmth that made Tansy's own cheeks heat slightly, despite her best effort to remain properly unbothered by royal attention. "I meant what I said, about the danger potentially following me here," he said more seriously. "If my pursuers tracked me this far, your farm, your animals, your own safety, all of it becomes considerably more complicated by my continued presence. Then we'll deal with that complication properly, when and if it actually arrives." Tansy met his gaze steadily, old stubbornness reasserting itself despite the genuine danger his warning implied. "I didn't survive 3 years running this farm alone by panicking at every hint of difficulty, Your Majesty. I imagine I can manage whatever your rival pack brings, same as I've managed everything else this land's thrown at me." Vesper studied her for a long moment, something in his golden eyes shifting into genuine, considerable respect. "I find myself increasingly grateful, Tansy Fernbrook, that Miller's Creek happened to deposit me specifically at your doorstep, rather than anyone else's. Don't thank the creek. Thank Duchess, honestly. She's the one who heard you thrashing about and started making enough noise to wake me properly. Then I suppose I owe your sheep my life. You owe Duchess considerably more than that, given how particular she is about repayment. I'd recommend finding her the best patch of clover on this entire hillside, if you're genuinely grateful." Vesper laughed again, warm and unguarded, and somewhere behind them, Sir Quacksworth let out a long, disapproving quack at the entire proceedings, though even the perpetually grumpy duck, Tansy noted with private amusement, had stopped actively trying to bite the stranger's ankles sometime around mid-morning, which she privately considered the closest thing to royal approval her household was likely to offer. That evening, once the animals were properly settled and the sun had begun its slow descent behind the hills, Tansy found Vesper standing at her garden fence, watching the flock graze with an expression considerably more thoughtful than the day's easy banter had suggested lurked beneath his exhaustion. "You're quiet," she observed, joining him. "I'm thinking about how strange this all is. Yesterday I was fleeing armed pursuers through unfamiliar territory, entirely uncertain whether I'd survive the night. Today I'm standing at a fence discussing sheep with a woman who compares me favorably to a stubborn ram." He glanced at her, something rueful in his expression. "It's rather a considerable shift in circumstance." Good or bad shift? Good, he said, with a certainty that surprised her. Considerably good, actually. I can't properly remember the last time I spent a day simply existing, without formal ceremony or careful political calculation shadowing every conversation. Well, you're welcome to keep existing here a while longer, provided you don't mind considerably more manure and considerably less ceremony than you're accustomed to. I find I don't mind at all, Vesper said, something warm settling into his tired golden eyes. Not remotely. Constable Biscuit, apparently sensing the moment required proper punctuation, chose that exact instant to eat a substantial portion of Vesper's borrowed shirt sleeve, and the evening dissolved, rather predictably, into chaos once again. By the third day, Vesper had recovered enough to properly attempt farm chores without immediately flooding half the yard, though properly remained a generous description of his continued efforts. You've put the harness on backwards, Tansy observed, watching him wrestle with Sir Reginald the ram, who stood stock still with the particular smug patience of a creature who fully intended to let this continue until it became maximally embarrassing for everyone involved. There's a correct orientation for a harness? There's a correct orientation for most things, Your Majesty, even ones that seem, at first glance, entirely symmetrical. Vesper straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool morning air, and regarded Sir Reginald with the particular exhausted respect of a man who had, over 3 days, developed genuine appreciation for exactly how much trouble one determined ram could cause. I begin to understand why you compared me to him so readily. He's remarkably stubborn. He's remarkably himself. Sir Reginald doesn't do anything he doesn't want to do, harness or no harness. Tansy crossed over to properly demonstrate, and the ram, recognizing an actual authority figure, allowed the correction with only minimal grumbling. There, see? He's not stubborn with me because I don't waste time arguing with him. Rams respect efficiency. I'll keep that in mind for future negotiations with stubborn creatures. Perhaps it applies equally well to certain members of my own council. Does your council also attempt to eat your clothing? Regrettably, no, though I've occasionally wished they would, given how much more straightforward that particular grievance would prove compared to their usual objections. It was later that morning, while Tansy checked the fence line along the property's eastern edge, that Vesper finally asked the question she'd been quietly expecting since his arrival. May I ask why you're managing this entire farm alone? 3 years, you mentioned. That's rather a considerable undertaking for one person, however capable. Something in Tansy's chest tightened, old grief resurfacing despite 3 years of practice keeping it properly contained. My grandmother raised me here, after my parents died in a territorial dispute when I was young. She taught me everything about the flock, about this land, about managing things properly even when circumstances seemed impossible. She paused at a loose fence post, testing it with practiced efficiency rather than looking at him directly. She passed 3 years ago. I could have sold the flock, moved somewhere with proper pack support, married into some other family's holdings the way half the village expected me to. I decided I'd rather keep what she built instead. That's remarkable dedication. It's mostly stubbornness, honestly, dressed up as dedication because stubbornness sounds less flattering. She finally glanced at him, something wry in her expression. Sir Reginald and I have rather a lot in common, apparently. I find that comparison considerably more flattering than you likely intended. Tansy laughed despite herself, and they continued their fence inspection in companionable quiet, Vesper occasionally offering surprisingly useful observations about weak points in the wood that suggested, despite his royal upbringing, some genuine practical knowledge lurking beneath the formal exterior. You know rather a lot about fence construction. For a king. I spent considerable time as a young pup exploring my own territory's borders, back before formal duties consumed most of my attention. I confess I've missed that particular simplicity more than I properly realized. until these past few days reminded me what it felt like. The rival pack's scouts found them on the 4th day. Tansy heard the commotion first, Sir Quacksworth's alarm quacking reaching a pitch she'd never before witnessed, followed immediately by Constable Biscuit's furious bleating and the distinct sound of hooves scattering in panic. She was out the cottage door within seconds, Vesper close behind her, both of them freezing at the sight of 3 unfamiliar men in dark leather at the property's edge, clearly searching the tree line with methodical, dangerous purpose. "Nightshade colors," Vesper murmured, low and grim, pulling her back toward the cottage's shadow. "Rival pack scouts. They've tracked me here. What do we do?" "You do nothing. You stay hidden, and I—" "Absolutely not." Tansy's voice carried a steel that surprised even herself. "This is my farm, Your Majesty. I'm not simply going to hide in my kitchen while armed strangers threaten my animals." Vesper opened his mouth to argue, caught the particular stubborn set of her jaw that he'd already learned, over 3 short days, meant argument was entirely pointless, and instead nodded once. Grim acceptance replacing protest. "Then stay behind me at minimum, please." The scouts spotted them before further planning proved possible, and Tansy watched, heart hammering, as the largest of the 3 strangers stepped forward with cold, calculating recognition. "King Vesper," he said, voice carrying unmistakable satisfaction. "We'd nearly given up hope of finding you before the trail went entirely cold." "Kessler." Vesper's voice had shifted entirely, all the warm, easy humor of the past 3 days replaced by something considerably harder and more commanding. "I'd hoped your pack had abandoned this particular pursuit." "Lord Thistledown doesn't abandon pursuits, Your Majesty, particularly not ones involving royal hostages worth considerable ransom." What followed happened faster than Tansy properly processed, Vesper stepping forward with sudden, sharp authority, the scouts' confident approach faltering slightly at whatever calculation crossed their faces, and then, entirely without warning, Constable Biscuit launching himself from somewhere behind the cottage directly into the nearest scout's legs with the full, devastating force of a goat who had spent his entire life training for exactly this moment. The scout went down hard, cursing, and in the chaos that followed, Sir Quacksworth diving at ankles with vicious, indignant fury, Duchess somehow materializing to headbutt a second scout with surprising force for an elderly sheep, and Sir Reginald charging the third with the particular unstoppable momentum of a ram who had finally found a rival worth properly intimidating. Tansy found herself laughing, despite the genuine danger, at the sheer, glorious absurdity of her farm's entire animal population apparently deciding, independently and simultaneously, that Royal Scouts made for excellent target practice. "Your animals," Vesper said, staring in open astonishment as Constable Biscuit pursued the fleeing first scout with single-minded determination, "are terrifying. They're protective. Once you're properly part of the household, apparently, that protection extends rather thoroughly." The scouts, thoroughly routed by a combination of livestock and Vesper's own sharp, commanding presence, retreated within minutes, though not without Kessler shouting a final, grim warning over his shoulder as he fled Sir Reginald's continued pursuit. "Lord Thistledown won't stop searching, Your Majesty. You can't hide behind farm animals forever." "Watch me," Vesper muttered, though loud enough only for Tansy to hear, something fierce and protective in his tone that made her breath catch slightly. Once the scouts had properly fled and the animal's adrenaline had settled into smug, self-satisfied preening, Vesper turned to Tansy with an expression caught somewhere between profound gratitude and genuine alarm. "That was considerably more dangerous than I intended for you to face," he said. "I should have insisted you remain hidden." "You should have known better than to insist anything to me, Your Majesty. I told you this is my farm, my animals. I wasn't going to simply watch from a window. Your animals nearly took 3 grown men apart entirely on their own initiative. They're rather protective of guests they've decided to properly accept," Tansy said, though her own hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly now that the danger had passed, I suppose that answers whether they've accepted you. Vesper studied her carefully, noting the shake in her hands despite her composed voice, and reached out, gently, to steady them within his own. You're frightened. I'm allowed to be frightened after armed strangers threaten my farm, Your Majesty. Doesn't mean I was about to simply hide. I know. Something warm and fierce entered his golden eyes. I find myself, watching you face that danger so directly, considerably more impressed than I properly know how to express. Most people at my own court would have fled at the first sign of Kessler's men. Most people at your court probably don't have Sir Reginald on their side. That earned a genuine warm laugh, cutting through the lingering tension, and Vesper, still holding her trembling hands, pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles with a tenderness that made her breath catch for an entirely different reason than fear. Thank you, he said quietly, for standing beside me rather than simply hiding away. I don't believe anyone's ever properly chosen to face danger alongside me rather than simply behind me in longer than I can remember. Someone has to keep Sir Reginald properly organized during a crisis, Tansy said, though her voice had gone considerably softer than her attempted humor suggested. Might as well be me. That evening, with the animals finally settled and adrenaline fully faded into exhausted quiet, Tansy found Vesper sitting on her front step, staring out at the darkening hills with an expression of considerable, private worry. They'll return, he said, without her needing to ask. Kessler's not the type to simply give up after one failed attempt. Lord Thistledown wants me captured, or dead, badly enough to have arranged that initial ambush in the first place. Then we'll be ready for them, same as today. I can't properly ask that of you, Tansy. This isn't your fight. You've already risked considerably more than any stranger should reasonably have to, simply by pulling me from that creek. You're not asking anything of me, Your Majesty. I'm choosing it. Tansy settled beside him, old stubbornness and something considerably warmer, both steadying her voice. I've spent 3 years alone on this hillside, managing everything myself, because I convinced myself that was simply how things had to be. These past few days, chaotic and dangerous as they've apparently become, are the first time in considerable years I haven't felt entirely alone in facing whatever difficulty arrives at my door. Vesper turned to study her properly, something raw and unguarded in his golden eyes. I find myself feeling rather similarly, honestly. Whatever danger my presence has brought to your doorstep, I confess I'm entirely unwilling to simply walk away from these past few days, however sensible that departure might prove. Then don't, Tansy said simply. Walk away, I mean. We'll figure out Lord Thistledown and his scouts together, same as we handled this morning's unwelcome visitors. With an army of farm animals as our primary defense. It worked rather well today, didn't it? Vesper laughed, warm and genuine, and reached over to take her hand properly, no longer simply steadying her trembling fingers, but holding them with clear, deliberate intention. I find myself, Tansy Fernbrook, increasingly certain that Miller's Creek did me considerably more favor than harm, depositing me precisely at your doorstep. Don't thank the creek, Tansy said, echoing her earlier words with a small, warm smile. Thank Duchess. She's the one who actually noticed you drowning. Then I owe your sheep considerably more gratitude than I've properly expressed. I'll see about that clover patch first thing tomorrow. She'll hold you to that promise, Your Majesty. Duchess doesn't forget a debt. Behind them, as if summoned by her own name, Duchess let out a long, satisfied bleat from her favorite grazing spot, entirely unbothered by the day's earlier chaos, and Tansy, watching Vesper's warm, unguarded laugh at the sound, found herself thinking that whatever danger Lord Thistledown's continued pursuit eventually brought to her hillside, she'd rather face it properly, beside this particular king, than return to the careful, solitary safety she'd maintained these past 3 lonely years. Word arrived 2 days later, carried by an exhausted messenger hawk that nearly collided with Tansy's chimney before dropping, with considerable indignity, into Vesper's waiting hands. "It's from my beta," Vesper said, scanning the hastily written note with visible tension building across his features. "Captain Renfield's been searching for me since the ambush. He's located our position, apparently, though he doesn't say how. Is that good or bad?" "Complicated." Vesper set the note down, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. "Good. In that, I now have proper support arriving, rather than facing Lord Thistledown's continued pursuit entirely alone. Complicated, in that Renfield's note also confirms Lord Thistledown's motivations run considerably deeper than simple ransom." "How much deeper?" "He wants my throne, Tansy. Not simply my capture or my death for political leverage, but the throne itself. There's an old, disputed claim running through his family line, one my own father settled decades ago through treaty rather than war. Apparently, Lord Thistledown's decided the treaty's no longer sufficiently binding, given my own father's death 3 years past, and what he presumably perceives as my own inexperience holding the crown alone." Tansy absorbed this, turning it over with the same careful attention she gave any genuine threat to her flock. "So this isn't simply about you personally. It's about an entire kingdom's stability." "Considerably so." Vesper's jaw tightened, "which makes your continued involvement in this mess considerably more dangerous than I properly accounted for these past days. Lord Thistledown won't simply retreat quietly if his ambitions run this deep. Then we'll need a better plan than simply relying on Sir Reginald's temper, I imagine." Despite the day's grim news, that earned a small, genuine smile from him. "I confess Sir Reginald performed rather admirably, given the circumstances. But yes, a more comprehensive plan seems increasingly necessary." Captain Renfield arrived the following afternoon, and Tansy found herself facing down a considerably more intimidating figure than the scouts who'd threatened her farm days earlier. Tall, scarred, and carrying the particular weathered competence of someone who'd survived considerable battle experience. "Your Majesty." Renfield dropped to one knee immediately upon spotting Vesper, relief evident despite his otherwise stoic bearing. "We feared the worst, given how thoroughly your trail vanished after the ambush. I owe my continued survival to Miss Fernbrook here," Vesper said, gesturing toward Tansy with genuine warmth. "And to her rather formidable collection of farm animals, as it happens." Renfield's eyebrows rose slightly, taking in Constable Biscuit's suspicious glare, and Sir Quacksworth's continued disapproving presence near the doorway. "Farm animals, Your Majesty?" "You'll understand better once you've properly witnessed them in action, Captain. I confess I've developed considerable respect for goats these past few days." Duchess, sensing new company, wandered over to sniff Renfield's boots with placid curiosity before losing interest entirely and returning to her sunny napping spot, and the captain, despite his evident battle-hardened composure, seemed genuinely charmed despite himself. "An unusual defense force, sire, but apparently an effective one. Effective enough to rout 3 of Kessler's scouts without a single proper weapon involved," Vesper confirmed, "though I don't intend to rely solely on livestock going forward, given what your note suggested about Lord Thistledown's deeper ambitions." The following hours passed in careful, strategic planning around Tansy's kitchen table, Renfield laying out formal maps and troop positions, while Vesper listened with the sharp, focused attention Tansy hadn't yet witnessed from him during their quieter days together. "Lord Thistledown's amassed considerable forces along the eastern border," Renfield reported. "If he intends to press his claim formally, he'll need a decisive victory to properly rally support from the other territorial lords who remain currently uncommitted. Capturing you here quietly would have provided exactly that leverage without requiring open conflict. And now that his scouts failed? Now, sire, I suspect he'll move rather more directly. A show of force, perhaps, or a formal challenge delivered through proper channels, betting that his numbers alone will discourage resistance." Vesper's expression had gone grave, the weight of genuine kingdom-spanning responsibility settling visibly across his tired features. I need to return to the capital properly, Renfield. Rally my own forces. Address the council directly before Thistledown's narrative gets ahead of the actual truth. Agreed, sire. Though I'd recommend departing within the day, given how quickly circumstances appear to be escalating. Something in Tansy's chest tightened at the mention of departure. Old loneliness she'd nearly forgotten these past days threatening to resurface. She busied herself with unnecessary tidying rather than properly examine the feeling, though Vesper, glancing her way, seemed to notice regardless. "Might I have a moment alone with Miss Fernbrook, Captain?" Renfield inclined his head with visible, tactful understanding, gathering his maps and retreating toward the yard to properly inspect the farm's defenses, leaving Tansy and Vesper alone in the sudden, heavy quiet of the kitchen. "I have to go," Vesper said quietly, once the door had properly closed behind Renfield. "I know." "I don't want to. I want that said plainly, before duty properly demands I leave regardless." He crossed to where she stood, taking her hands with the same gentle intention he'd offered days earlier. "These past several days have been, without exaggeration, some of the most genuine and unguarded I've experienced in considerable years as king. I find myself entirely unwilling to simply walk away from what's grown between us, whatever formal obligation currently demands my departure." "Then don't treat this as goodbye," Tansy said, old stubbornness steadying her voice despite the ache building in her chest. "Handle your kingdom, Your Majesty. Face Lord Thistledown properly, with your own forces rather than simply my goat's temper. And then, once matters are properly settled, come back." "You'd want that? Genuinely, despite everything complicated my continued presence would bring?" "I've spent 3 years managing this farm entirely alone, Vesper." She used his given name deliberately, watching something warm flicker in his golden eyes at the informality. "These past few days, chaotic and dangerous as they've proven, are the first time I haven't felt that particular loneliness pressing quite so heavily. I'd rather risk complication than return to that solitary quiet without at least properly trying." Vesper's answering smile carried genuine, unguarded warmth, and he leaned in to press a gentle, lingering kiss to her forehead. "Then I promise you, Tansy Fernbrook, once Lord Thistledown's ambitions are properly addressed, I'll return. Not as an obligation, but because I find myself, for the first time in longer than I can properly remember, genuinely wanting to." The departure itself proved considerably more chaotic than either of them properly anticipated, Sir Reginald apparently deciding, at the worst possible moment, that Renfield's horse represented a personal rival requiring immediate confrontation, while Constable Biscuit attempted to climb into the captain's supply cart under the mistaken impression it contained something edible. "Your animals," Renfield observed, extracting Constable Biscuit from among his formal correspondence with visible exasperation, "are considerably more trouble than an entire company of soldiers, sire. I did warn you, Captain. You undersold the warning considerably." Once the animals had finally been properly wrangled and the horses calmed, Vesper turned back to Tansy one final time, something solemn and genuine in his golden eyes. "I'll send word as soon as matters allow," he said. "And I'll return properly, Tansy. I promise you that." "I'll hold you to it, Your Majesty. Duchess will as well, given that clover patch you still owe her." That earned a genuine laugh despite the weight of the moment, and Vesper, mounting his own borrowed horse with visibly reluctant formality, offered one final, lingering look before the small party finally rode off down the hillside path, leaving Tansy standing alone at her fence, watching until they'd disappeared entirely into the distant tree line. The following days passed in a strange, hollow quiet that Tansy hadn't properly experienced in years. The farm's usual chores feeling somehow emptier despite her animals' continued, oblivious presence. "You miss him," Duchess seemed to say, with the particular pointed stare she reserved for moments requiring proper acknowledgement, though Tansy suspected she was simply projecting her own feelings onto an elderly sheep's ordinary expression. "I do," she admitted aloud anyway, mostly for her own benefit. "Which is entirely absurd, given I've known the man barely a week, most of that time spent nursing him back to health and preventing Constable Biscuit from eating his clothing. Constable Biscuit, hearing his name, wandered over with visible interest, though whether from genuine concern or simple hope of treats remained characteristically unclear. "I know," Tansy told him, scratching behind his ears with practiced affection. "It's ridiculous. He's a king, currently facing down a rival lord's entire army, and here I am, worrying about him between milking chores like some lovesick village girl." Sir Quacksworth, apparently deciding the entire conversation warranted commentary, let out a long, judgmental quack from his usual perch. "You're not helping, Sir Quacksworth." The duck, predictably, offered no further insight, and Tansy returned to her chores with the particular determined focus of someone trying rather hard not to properly examine exactly how much she'd come to care for a king she'd known scarcely a week, though the worry, once acknowledged, refused to properly settle, following her through each remaining chore with the persistent, nagging weight of genuine feeling she'd carefully avoided allowing herself these past 3 solitary years. She found herself, that evening, standing at the same fence where they'd shared their first quiet conversation, watching the darkening hills with an anxious hope she hadn't properly felt in longer than she cared to admit. "Come back safely," she murmured to the empty horizon, old loneliness and fresh, unexpected affection both tangling together in her chest. "Whatever Lord Thistledown throws at you, Your Majesty, come back." It was nearly a week before the next word arrived. Not another exhausted hawk this time, but a rider approaching the property with careful, deliberate pace that made Tansy's heart leap into her throat before she'd even properly identified who it was. It was Renfield, alone, dust-covered from hard travel, and Tansy felt her stomach drop at the sight of him arriving without Vesper alongside. "Is he—" she started, unable to finish the question. "Alive and well, Miss Fernbrook," Renfield said quickly, catching her alarm immediately. "Forgive me for causing you unnecessary fright. His Majesty sent me ahead with word, given how thoroughly the situation's developed these past days." Relief flooded through her so completely her knees nearly buckled, and she gripped the fence post for support, old composure momentarily entirely abandoned. "Tell me everything, Captain. Please." Renfield dismounted, accepting the water she offered with visible gratitude before properly beginning his account. Lord Thistledown attempted his show of force 3 days past, exactly as anticipated. His Majesty addressed the full council directly, laid out the ambush and Thistledown's deeper ambitions plainly before every territorial lord currently gathered at court. The evidence, combined with Kessler's own scout's testimony once properly captured and questioned, turned considerable sentiment against Thistledown's claim rather decisively. "So it's over? Vesper's safe?" "The immediate danger's past, yes. Formal negotiations continue regarding Thistledown's punishment and the broader territorial dispute, but His Majesty's position is considerably more secure than it was even a week ago." Renfield's stern expression softened slightly. "He asked me to deliver this personally, Miss Fernbrook, along with his word that he intends to return within the fortnight, once the most pressing formal matters are properly addressed." He produced a sealed letter, and Tansy took it with hands that trembled slightly more than the week's worry alone could properly explain. "Tansy, Thistledown's ambitions have been properly addressed, though the formal consequences will take some weeks yet to fully settle. I find myself, even amid considerable political chaos, thinking of your hillside farm rather more than affairs of state properly permit. I meant every word before I left. I intend to return properly the moment circumstances allow, not as an obligation, but because Miller's Creek gave me something in you I have no intention of simply letting go. Give Duchess my regards, and tell Constable Biscuit I haven't forgotten his considerable bravery." Vesper Tansy read the letter twice, tears she hadn't properly expected pricking at her eyes, and Renfield, with visible tact, busied himself checking his horse's tack rather than comment on her obvious emotion. "He's a good man," the captain said eventually, gruffly. "Whatever chaos surrounds his crown, I've served him 8 years now, and I've rarely seen him speak of anything or anyone with quite the warmth he showed writing that letter. Thank you, Captain, for bringing it. For the update, my pleasure, Miss Fernbrook, though I confess I'm rather looking forward to witnessing his eventual return, if only to properly observe how your goat greets him a second time. Tansy laughed despite her lingering emotion, watching Renfield mount back up for his return journey, and found herself, once he'd disappeared down the hillside path, clutching Vesper's letter to her chest, with a hope she hadn't allowed herself to properly feel in considerable years. The fragile, growing certainty that whatever remarkable chaotic beginning Miller's Creek had provided them both, it was only just properly starting. The promised fortnight stretched into 3 weeks, then nearly 4, and Tansy found herself, despite her best efforts at patient composure, checking the hillside path considerably more often than farm chores properly warranted. He said a fortnight, she informed Duchess one particularly gray afternoon, mending a torn fence post with more force than the task strictly required. It's been nearly a month, Duchess. Kingdoms apparently take considerably longer to properly settle than a king's letter suggested. Duchess, unbothered as always, continued grazing without comment, though Constable Biscuit chose that moment to wander over and headbutt the fence post Tansy had just finished repairing, undoing several minutes of careful work in a single enthusiastic assault. You're not helping either, Tansy told him, though her scolding lacked any real heat. It was Sir Quacksworth, oddly enough, who first noticed the approaching rider, his alarm quacking reaching a considerably different pitch than his usual grumpy commentary, something almost excited rather than purely irritated. Tansy looked up from her mending to find a lone figure on horseback cresting the hill's distant ridge, and her heart leapt into her throat before she'd properly confirmed who it was. She didn't wait for certainty. She was already moving, dropping her tools entirely, running toward the approaching horse with a complete disregard for dignity that would have embarrassed her considerably under any other circumstances. Vesper dismounted before his horse had properly stopped, closing the remaining distance at a run that matched her own, and when they finally collided, breathless and laughing despite the month's accumulated worry, Tansy found herself pulled into an embrace so thorough and genuine that every anxious day of waiting dissolved entirely into pure, overwhelming relief. You're late, she managed, muffled against his shoulder. Kingdoms are considerably more stubborn than farm animals, apparently, Vesper said, pulling back just enough to properly look at her, golden eyes bright with the same warmth she remembered from their week together. Though, I promise you, not a single day passed that I didn't think of returning here. The full account, once they'd settled properly at her kitchen table with tea, neither of them particularly drank, proved considerably more dramatic than Renfield's earlier brief report had suggested. Thistledown didn't simply accept the council's judgment, Vesper explained, exhaustion evident beneath his obvious happiness at finally returning. He attempted one final desperate gambit, a formal challenge, invoking an old law neither I nor most of the current council properly remembered existed, demanding trial by combat rather than accept the council's political ruling. Trial by combat? That sounds considerably more dangerous than farm animal defense. Considerably, Vesper agreed grimly. Though I confess, having survived Constable Biscuit's training regimen these past weeks, I found myself rather better prepared for direct confrontation than Thistledown properly anticipated. Tansy stared at him. You fought him. Personally. The law required direct combat between claimants, yes. I couldn't very well send Renfield in my place, whatever his own considerable skill. Vesper rolled up his sleeve, revealing a still-healing scar along his forearm that hadn't been there weeks earlier. It was closer than I'd have preferred, admittedly, but I won properly before the full assembled council and every territorial lord whose support Thistledown had hoped to rally. You could have died. I could have. I didn't. He took her hand, something gentle beneath his continued exhaustion. I confess, mid-combat, I found myself thinking rather more about returning to this hillside than any particular fear of the outcome. It's a strange thing, having something worth fighting properly to return to, after years of simply performing duty without much genuine reason beyond obligation. Something in Tansy's chest ached at that admission. Old loneliness and fresh, overwhelming affection tangling together as she studied the healing scar with careful, worried attention. "Well," she said finally, voice unsteady, "I suppose I should properly thank whatever combat training kept you alive, given how thoroughly Duchess would have judged me for losing you before that clover patch was ever delivered." Vesper laughed, warm and genuine, and the tension of the past month's worry finally, fully broke between them. The following days passed in a warmth Tansy hadn't properly allowed herself to imagine possible, Vesper settling back into farm life with considerably more competence than his first awkward attempts weeks earlier, the animals greeting his return with what could only be described as genuine, enthusiastic welcome, and evenings spent talking long into the night about everything from Thistledown's formal punishment to the particular absurd joy of watching Constable Biscuit attempt, once again, to eat anything left within reach. "Thistledown's been formally stripped of his territory," Vesper mentioned one evening. The two of them settled on her front step watching the sunset paint the hills gold. "His holdings redistributed among the neighboring lords who remained loyal throughout the dispute. He'll live, though considerably diminished from his previous ambition." "That seems fair, given everything he attempted." "Fair, and considerably more merciful than several council members initially proposed. I find myself, these past weeks, increasingly interested in justice that corrects rather than simply punishes, wherever that balance proves possible." "That's rather wise, for a king who spent his first proper conversation with me arguing about harness orientation." Vesper laughed, leaning back against the step's worn wood with visible, genuine contentment. "I contain multitudes, apparently, Tansy Fernbrook. Harness confusion and hard-won political wisdom both, in equal measure." It was Renfield, arriving a week later with formal correspondence requiring Vesper's urgent attention, who first properly raised the question neither of them had yet directly addressed. "Forgive my bluntness, sire," the captain said, once the formal business had been properly concluded, "but the council's beginning to ask rather pointed questions about your continued extended absences from the capital. A king's duties don't simply pause because he's found pleasant company on a hillside farm." "I'm aware, Renfield. I only raise it because formal decisions will need making, sooner rather than later, regarding exactly how Miss Fernbrook's continued presence in your life is meant to be properly understood by the wider court." Vesper glanced at Tansy, something careful and considering in his expression, and she felt her stomach tighten with sudden, genuine nervousness at the implication. "What are you suggesting, Renfield?" "I'm suggesting, sire, that farm visits and a stolen fortnight are lovely, but a king's heart eventually requires rather more formal acknowledgement if his intentions run as deep as I've observed these past weeks." Renfield's stern expression softened slightly. "The council will need an answer eventually, Your Majesty. I'd simply rather you properly consider the question before it's forced upon you less gently." He departed shortly after, leaving Vesper and Tansy alone in a considerably heavier silence than the day's earlier easy warmth had suggested was likely. "He's not wrong," Vesper said finally, quiet and thoughtful. "I can't properly split my life indefinitely between capital duties and hillside visits. However much I genuinely prefer exactly that arrangement. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Vesper said, turning to face her fully, something warm and entirely certain settling into his golden eyes despite the day's serious turn, "that I've spent considerable weeks now entirely certain about what I want, Tansy. I simply haven't yet found proper words, or proper timing, to say it as thoroughly as it deserves." Tansy's breath caught, old caution warring with the accumulated warmth of these past remarkable weeks. "Vesper—" "Not tonight," he said gently, taking her hand. "I don't want to rush something this significant simply because Renfield's formal pressure demands quick resolution. But I want you to know plainly that whatever answer eventually comes, It involves you staying properly in my life, not as a stolen fortnight's pleasant memory, but as something considerably more permanent, if you'll have it." Something warm and hopeful bloomed in Tansy's chest at that. Old solitary caution, finally, thoroughly giving way to genuine, unguarded hope. "I find myself rather open to that particular arrangement, Your Majesty. Whatever proper words and proper timing eventually bring it about." Vesper's answering smile carried the same warmth she'd first glimpsed weeks earlier, watching him laugh at Duchess's pointed napping habits. And outside, as if sensing the moment properly deserved punctuation, Constable Biscuit let out a long, satisfied bleat from somewhere near the garden, entirely unbothered by the significant conversation unfolding just beyond his notice. Vesper stayed 3 more days before duty finally demanded his proper return to the capital, and this departure, though no less difficult than the first, carried a considerably steadier certainty between them than their earlier, more uncertain farewell. "I'll write properly this time," he promised, checking his horse's saddle with the same careful attention he'd learned, over these past weeks, to apply to farm chores generally. Not simply brief updates through exhausted messenger hawks, but proper letters regularly. So you're never left wondering as long as you were this past month. "I'll hold you to that, Your Majesty. I rather hope you will." He reached over, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a tenderness that made her breath catch, same as it had that very first morning she'd discovered a king tangled in her second-best quilt. "Whatever formal announcement eventually comes, Tansy, I want you to know it's already decided, in every way that properly matters. I simply need to manage the considerable ceremony my council insists such decisions require." Ceremony sounds exhausting. It is, remarkably. I find myself already looking forward to escaping back to this hillside the moment it's properly concluded. She walked him to the property's edge, Duchess and Constable Biscuit trailing along with the particular loyal curiosity they'd developed toward him these past weeks, and when he finally mounted his horse for the return journey, he paused one final moment to look back at her. "Thank you," he said simply, "for pulling a drowning wolf out of your creek weeks ago without any idea what you were actually rescuing. I'd have pulled you out regardless, Your Majesty. King or ordinary wolf. That's simply what I do, apparently, with foolish, drowning creatures who wander too close to Miller's Creek." Vesper's laugh, warm and genuine, carried back to her long after he'd disappeared down the familiar hillside path, and Tansy, standing at her fence with Duchess settling contentedly beside her, found herself considerably more hopeful about whatever proper ceremony and formal announcement eventually awaited them both than she'd believed herself capable of feeling in the 3 long, solitary years before Miller's Creek delivered her, quite unexpectedly, an entire kingdom's worth of complicated, wonderful chaos. That evening, alone again but no longer lonely in quite the same way, Tansy sat on her front step with a cup of tea and watched the stars emerge over the quiet hills. Sir Quacksworth waddled over to settle, with uncharacteristic gentleness, near her feet, and even Constable Biscuit, usually far too busy plotting fence post demolition to properly sit still, curled up nearby with a contented sigh. "He's coming back properly," she told them both, scratching behind Constable Biscuit's ears. "Not simply visiting. Properly this time, once all the ceremony's finished." Duchess, from her spot a few feet away, let out a long, satisfied bleat that Tansy chose, entirely without evidence, to interpret as approval. "I thought you'd say that," she said, laughing softly into the quiet evening air, already counting the days until his next letter arrived. The formal summons arrived 3 weeks later, considerably more official than any of Vesper's previous letters, sealed with the royal crest, addressed properly to Miss Tansy Fernbrook of Miller's Creek Farm, and requesting her presence at the capital for what it vaguely described as matters of considerable importance to the crown. "That's ominous," Tansy told Duchess, reading the letter for the 3rd time with growing nervousness. "Matters of considerable importance. That could mean anything." Duchess, predictably, offered no opinion on the matter, though Constable Biscuit headbutted the letter directly out of Tansy's hands, which she chose to interpret as either supportive encouragement or simple goat nonsense, depending on how generously she wanted to read the gesture. Renfield arrived the following day to personally escort her, considerably more cheerful than his usual stern demeanor typically allowed. "You seem pleased about something, Captain." "I am, Miss Fernbrook, though I've been sworn to secrecy regarding the particulars. I'll simply say that His Majesty's spent the past 3 weeks considerably more distracted and considerably happier than I've witnessed in the 8 years I've served him, and I suspect today's summons has rather a lot to do with both." "That doesn't remotely settle my nerves, Captain." "It wasn't entirely meant to, Miss Fernbrook. I find a little proper anticipation does a person good." The capital, when they finally arrived after 2 days' travel, proved every bit as overwhelming as Tansy had privately feared. Grand towers, bustling streets, and a palace considerably larger than her entire hillside farm could have contained twice over. She'd left the animals behind under the watchful, grumbling care of a neighboring farmer, though she suspected, given how thoroughly Constable Biscuit had sulked at her departure, she'd be hearing about the arrangement's cost for weeks. "I don't belong here," she murmured to Renfield, taking in the sheer scale of the royal grounds with growing anxiety. "I'm a shepherd, Captain. I milk goats and mend fences. I don't know the first thing about proper court behavior." "Neither did the last 3 generations of kings, if court gossips to be believed," Renfield said dryly. "You'll manage, Miss Fernbrook. His Majesty certainly believes so, and I've rarely known him wrong about matters this significant." Vesper met her at the palace gates himself, dressed in formal royal attire that struck her as almost comically grand compared to the mud-stained farmer's clothes he'd borrowed weeks earlier, though his warm, unguarded smile upon spotting her carried exactly the same genuine affection she remembered from their quiet hillside evenings. "You came," he said, crossing to properly embrace her despite the visible surprise of several nearby palace attendants. "You did send rather an official-sounding summons, Your Majesty. I confess curiosity alone would have brought me, even without the formal seal. I promise the formalities necessary, however much I'd have preferred simply writing another ordinary letter." He offered his arm, something nervous beneath his obvious happiness. "Come. There's rather a lot I need to properly explain before the council session begins." He led her not directly toward the throne room, but to a smaller private study, where Renfield's earlier good cheer suddenly made considerably more sense once Vesper began explaining the summons's true complicated purpose. "It's not simply a formal announcement I intended," he admitted, pacing the study with visible nervous energy. "Though I do intend that, properly, before the full court. There's also a rather more delicate matter the council's insisted on addressing first." "Which is?" "Lord Thistledown's holdings," Vesper said grimly. "His formal punishment redistributed most of his territory, as I mentioned. But there's a considerable faction among the surviving nobility who've grown uneasy about the precedent. A king choosing an unranked commoner, however celebrated her rescue, over the traditional marriage alliances that typically secure a crown's political stability." Something cold settled in Tansy's stomach. "They object to me." "Some do, yes. Not all, and considerably fewer than existed even a month ago, given how thoroughly your role in exposing Thistledown's ambitions has already shifted public sentiment. But enough remain concerned that the council's requested a formal audience before any announcement to properly voice their reservations directly. You want me to face them. Today. I want you to know precisely what you're walking into before you decide whether you're willing to walk into it at all," Vesper said, taking her hands with careful, genuine seriousness. "I won't pretend this will be simple, Tansy. Court politics rarely are. If you'd rather I handle this differently, protect you from that particular confrontation entirely, I'll find another way." Tansy considered this, old stubbornness from 3 solitary years of farm management settling steady beneath her nervousness. "No," she said finally. "I didn't survive Thistledown's own scouts by hiding behind a king. I'm not about to start hiding from a council of nervous nobles now." Something fierce and proud flickered across Vesper's expression at that. "I rather hoped you'd say precisely that." The council chamber, when they finally entered, proved considerably more intimidating than the earlier throne room's grand scale had suggested. A smaller, more formal space where a dozen stern-faced nobles sat arranged around a long table, several regarding Tansy's entrance with open, unhidden skepticism. "Your Majesty," the presiding elder said formally, "and this is the young woman in question." "Tansy Fernbrook," Vesper said, something protective entering his voice. "Whom I've already introduced to this council's attention through Captain Renfield's formal reports regarding Thistledown's defeat." A sharp-featured noblewoman near the table's far end spoke first, her tone carrying careful, pointed skepticism. "Reports of a farm's animals routing armed scouts, Your Majesty. Forgive me. But such accounts read rather more like village folklore than proper military assessment." "I assure you, Lady Varick, the accounts are entirely accurate," Renfield said, standing formally at the chamber's edge. "I witnessed the aftermath myself. 3 trained scouts, thoroughly routed by farm animals and Miss Fernbrook's own quick thinking, before I ever arrived to properly assist. Impressive, certainly," Lady Varick allowed, though her skepticism remained evident. Impressive does not necessarily translate to proper qualification for a queen's considerable responsibilities, however. Tansy felt old anger stir beneath her nervousness, not unlike the particular frustration she'd felt years earlier. Watching her village assume a young orphaned shepherd couldn't possibly manage her grandmother's flock alone. "With respect, my lady," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice emerged. "I've spent 3 years managing an entire farm independently, budgeting resources through difficult winters, negotiating fair prices at market despite merchants who assumed a woman alone could be easily cheated, and making considered decisions about matters of genuine consequence. Which animals to breed, which to sell, how to properly weather droughts that threatened an entire flock's survival. I'm not certain what particular qualification you believe a queen requires that 3 years of exactly that kind of responsible, difficult management fails to provide." The chamber went quiet, several council members exchanging surprised glances at her directness, and Lady Varick's stern expression shifted, fractionally, into something closer to reluctant reconsideration. "That's rather a compelling account, Miss Fernbrook," she said finally, "though I confess the council will require considerably more discussion before any formal endorsement, however compelling today's testimony proves." "That's entirely fair, my lady," Tansy said. "I'd only ask that whatever discussion follows judges me by my actual character and capability, rather than simply my birth or lack of traditional title." Vesper, watching this exchange with visible, restrained pride, caught her eye briefly, and something warm passed between them despite the chamber's continued tension. "The council will deliberate properly," the presiding elder announced, "and deliver formal response within the week. Until then, Your Majesty, I'd suggest postponing any public announcement." Vesper's jaw tightened slightly, though he inclined his head with careful, formal patience. "As the council wishes." They left the chamber considerably more subdued than they'd entered it, and Tansy found herself, once they'd reached the relative privacy of the palace gardens, finally allowing some of her carefully maintained composure to properly crack. "That went rather worse than I'd hoped," she admitted. "It went considerably better than I feared, actually," Vesper said, though his own tension remained evident. "Lady Varick's opposition was the most vocal I anticipated facing. If even she's willing to properly reconsider, I suspect the broader council will follow, given sufficient time. A week's rather a long time to wait for permission to simply exist as your intended wife." "I know." He took her hand, something apologetic in his expression. "I'm sorry, Tansy. I'd hoped today would prove simpler than it has. I confess I underestimated how much resistance remained, even after everything Thistledown's defeat already shifted." Don't apologize for your own counsel doing their proper job, however frustrating I find their skepticism personally." Tansy managed a small, tired smile. "I'd rather earn their genuine respect properly than have it simply handed over through royal decree. Even if that means waiting a rather uncomfortable week for their decision." Vesper studied her with visible, growing admiration. "You're remarkable, you know. Facing that entire chamber with more composure than several seasoned diplomats I've watched crumble under considerably gentler questioning." "I've faced down an angry ram protecting his territory, Your Majesty. A room full of nervous nobles is rather less intimidating by comparison." That earned a genuine, warm laugh, cutting through the afternoon's accumulated tension, though as they settled onto a garden bench to properly wait out whatever the coming week's deliberation ultimately decided, Tansy found herself wondering, with growing unease, exactly what particular arguments Lady Varick and her allies might yet raise, and whether a week would prove sufficient time to properly settle a matter that, she was beginning to understand, involved considerably more than simple royal romance. The week's wait proved considerably more eventful than Tansy had properly anticipated, filled not with idle worry, but with an unexpected education in court politics she'd never once imagined needing. "You'll need proper preparation," Marchioness Aldwyn announced on the second morning, arriving at Tansy's guest chambers with the particular brisk energy of a woman who'd clearly appointed herself unofficial advisor, without waiting for formal invitation. "Whatever the council decides, you'll benefit from understanding precisely who you're dealing with, going forward." "I confess I don't even know who you are properly, Marchioness." "Forgive me. Marchioness Aldwyn, head of the royal household, and one of the few council members who voted rather firmly in your favor during yesterday's private preliminary discussion." She settled into a chair with brisk efficiency. "I find myself considerably tired of watching this court reward calculated ambition over genuine character, Miss Fernbrook. Your testimony yesterday impressed me rather more than most formally trained diplomatic candidates manage." "Thank you, though I confess I'm still uncertain why Lady Varick's opposition carries such weight." Lady Varick's family lost considerable standing 3 generations back, when a similar romantic match, a king's genuine affection over strategic alliance, resulted in poor governance and near civil war. She's not entirely wrong to carry historical caution, whatever her current motivations. I simply believe her caution's grown rather too rigid to properly account for individual circumstance. Marchioness Aldwyn proved an invaluable, if occasionally overwhelming guide through the following days, explaining court history, the particular alliances and rivalries currently shaping council opinion, and the considerable weight various noble families placed on matters Tansy had never once properly considered during her quiet years of farm management. "You'll want to understand Lord Pemberton's position specifically," the Marchioness said, midway through their 3rd day of intensive briefing. "He's remained publicly neutral, though I suspect he's leaning toward supporting the match, provided you can properly demonstrate genuine understanding of the responsibilities involved, rather than simple romantic devotion alone." "I don't have anything beyond genuine devotion to offer, though. I'm not a diplomat or a strategist. I'm a shepherd." "You're a shepherd who managed independent survival through 3 difficult years, who faced down armed scouts with nothing but farm animals and quick thinking, and who spoke to an entire hostile council with more composure than most formally trained candidates manage under considerably gentler pressure." Marchioness Aldwyn's stern expression softened slightly. "Don't undersell your own qualifications, Miss Fernbrook, simply because they don't match traditional expectation. Genuine capability rarely announces itself through expected channels." Tansy found herself, over the following days, absorbing considerably more than she'd properly expected. The delicate balance of power between the eastern and western territorial lords, the particular history of grain shortages 3 winters past that still colored several council members' economic anxieties, the careful diplomatic language required for addressing visiting delegations from neighboring kingdoms. It felt, some evenings, like attempting to properly learn an entirely new language on top of managing her usual farm responsibilities from a considerable distance. "You're exhausted," Vesper observed one evening, finding her slumped over a stack of Marchioness Aldwyn's notes on regional politics, ink smudged across one cheek where she'd fallen asleep mid-study. "I'm attempting to properly understand 3 generations of territorial disputes in the span of a single week, Your Majesty. Exhaustion seems rather the expected outcome. You needn't master everything immediately. Genuine understanding comes with time, same as it did for me, growing up within this particular chaos." He gently wiped the ink smudge from her cheek, something tender in the gesture. "I fell in love with a woman who mends fences and negotiates fair prices at market, Tansy. Not a woman who's already memorized 3 generations of grain shortage politics in a single sleepless week. I want to properly earn the council's respect, though, not simply rely on your affection to smooth over every gap in my understanding. You're already earning it, considerably faster than you're giving yourself credit for." Vesper settled beside her, taking her tired hands in his own. "Rest, love. Tomorrow's another day of preparation. Tonight, simply rest." It was on the 4th day that Lady Varick herself sought Tansy out directly, finding her alone in the palace gardens where she'd retreated for a rare moment of quiet reflection amid the week's overwhelming political education. "Miss Fernbrook," Lady Varick said, settling onto the garden bench without invitation. "I confess I hadn't expected to find you alone. I'd rather assumed Marchioness Aldwyn would keep you thoroughly occupied throughout this entire waiting period. She's been generous with her time, certainly. I confess I needed a moment away from quite so much intensive briefing." "Understandable." Lady Varick studied her for a long, careful moment. "I want to be direct with you, Miss Fernbrook, rather than continue the careful political maneuvering this week's proceedings have otherwise demanded. My opposition isn't personal cruelty, whatever it may have appeared during yesterday's session. I didn't take it as cruelty, simply caution. Precisely caution, yes." Lady Varick's composed expression carried something almost weary beneath its usual sharp formality. "My grandmother lived through the civil unrest that followed a similar romantic match, generations back. She watched an entire kingdom nearly collapse because a king's genuine affection wasn't properly balanced against the practical demands of actual governance. I've carried that family history rather heavily throughout my own considerable years serving this council. I understand that history matters. I'd only ask that you judge me by my own actual character, rather than simply history's worst possible outcome repeating itself." "That's precisely why I sought you out today," Lady Varick said. "I want to properly understand your actual character, beyond formal council testimony. Tell me honestly, Miss Fernbrook, if the council ultimately rejects this match, what would you do?" Tansy considered the question carefully, old stubbornness and genuine affection both weighing into her answer. "I'd return to my farm," she said finally. "I'd grieve, certainly, more deeply than I properly know how to express. But I wouldn't ask Vesper to abandon his crown's genuine responsibility for my sake, whatever personal cost that restraint demanded of either of us. I love him considerably, Lady Varick. I don't love him so selfishly that I'd want him to sacrifice his kingdom's stability simply to keep me beside him." Something shifted in Lady Varick's expression at that. Surprise, genuine and unguarded, quickly followed by something closer to reluctant respect. "That's not the answer I expected," she admitted. "What answer did you expect?" "Desperate insistence, perhaps. Some argument about love conquering practical concern entirely." Lady Varick studied her with fresh consideration. "Your willingness to properly prioritize the kingdom's actual welfare, even at considerable personal cost, speaks rather more to genuine character than any amount of formal diplomatic training could properly demonstrate." "I meant every word, my lady." "I believe you did." Lady Varick paused, something more personal entering her formal composure. "May I ask you something else, Miss Fernbrook? Rather less formal than the council's usual concerns." "Of course." "Do you actually want this life? Not simply Vesper himself, but the crown, the ceremony, the endless political scrutiny that will follow you for the remainder of your days, should the council approve this match. I've watched several genuinely loving matches wither under exactly that particular pressure over my considerable years at court. Tansy considered the question with the same careful honesty she'd offered throughout the difficult week. I won't pretend it doesn't frighten me, my lady. I've spent 3 years valuing simplicity and independence above nearly everything else. This life offers neither, most days. She glanced toward the palace's grand towers, considering her answer fully. But I've also spent 3 years rather lonely, without properly acknowledging it, until Vesper's arrival reminded me what genuine partnership actually felt like. I'd rather face considerable difficulty alongside him than return to comfortable solitude without him. That's a rather mature answer for someone facing such a significant, frightening decision. I've had considerable practice making difficult decisions alone, my lady. I'd simply rather not make them alone any longer if I don't have to. Lady Varick rose, smoothing her formal skirts with practiced efficiency, something genuinely thoughtful in her expression that hadn't been present at the conversation's start. I won't promise you my support, Miss Fernbrook. I have considerable history and considerable caution still weighing on my final judgment. But I'll say this. You've given me rather more to properly reconsider than I anticipated, walking into this garden today. She departed with formal grace, and Tansy remained alone on the bench a while longer, turning over the unexpected conversation with cautious, uncertain hope. The council reconvened on the appointed day, the formal chamber filled with considerably more tension than the initial audience had carried. Every council member's expression carefully composed as Tansy and Vesper entered together. Marchioness Aldwyn caught Tansy's eye briefly from her seat near the chamber's edge, offering a small, encouraging nod that steadied her nerves fractionally as she took her place beside Vesper before the assembled table. The council has deliberated properly, the presiding elder announced, regarding the matter of His Majesty's intended marriage to Miss Tansy Fernbrook of Miller's Creek Farm. Tansy felt Vesper's hand find hers beneath the formal table's edge, steady and warm despite his own visible tension. Several members raised genuine historically grounded concerns, the elder continued, regarding precedent and political stability. Others argued equally genuine merit in Miss Fernbrook's demonstrated character and capability, considerably beyond what traditional noble birth typically guarantees. Lord Pemberton rose first, a stocky, gray-bearded man whose neutral stance Marchioness Aldwyn had flagged as potentially decisive. I confess I entered this deliberation with considerable reservation, he said. I've watched royal romance override sound political judgment before, with genuinely disastrous consequence. But Miss Fernbrook's testimony this past week, and her demonstrated grasp of this kingdom's economic and territorial complexities, exceeded my expectations considerably. I'm inclined to support the match, provided proper formal preparation continues. A murmur of interest moved through the chamber, and Tansy felt a fraction of her tension ease at the unexpected endorsement. Lady Varick rose then, and Tansy's heart hammered with sudden, sharp anxiety as the noblewoman's composed expression gave nothing away. I spoke with Miss Fernbrook directly this past week, Lady Varick said, addressing the full assembled council. I asked her a difficult question regarding what she would do should this council ultimately reject the match. Her answer, I confess, surprised me considerably, a willingness to prioritize this kingdom's genuine welfare over her own personal happiness, without hesitation or resentment. A murmur moved through the chamber at this unexpected testimony. I carry considerable historical caution regarding matches driven by genuine affection over strategic calculation, Lady Varick continued. I won't pretend that caution has simply vanished, but I've come to believe, watching Miss Fernbrook's conduct these past days, that character matters rather more than birth in properly determining a queen's actual fitness for the role. I withdraw my formal opposition. The chamber erupted into surprised murmuring, and Tansy felt tears prick unexpectedly at the noblewoman's unexpected reversal. Given Lady Varick's reconsideration, the presiding elder said, once the chamber had properly settled, and the considerable shift in broader council sentiment these past days, I call for formal vote. All in favor of approving His Majesty's intended marriage to Miss Tansy Fernbrook signify accordingly. Hand after hand rose around the formal table, considerably more than Tansy had dared properly hope for, and when the final count was announced, overwhelming approval, with only 2 dissenting votes remaining, she found herself entirely unable to properly contain her emotion, tears spilling over as Vesper pulled her into a fierce, relieved embrace, despite the chamber's formal audience. "You did that," he murmured against her hair. "Whatever grace and honesty you showed this council, you earned this properly, entirely on your own merit." "We did it," Tansy corrected, echoing words that had become something of a private refrain between them these past months. "I couldn't have managed a single moment of this week without your steady support, and Marchioness Aldwyn's considerable patience, and even Lady Varick's genuine willingness to properly reconsider." The 2 dissenting council members approached briefly before the chamber fully dispersed. An older lord named Fenimore, and a younger noblewoman whose name Tansy hadn't yet properly learned, both offering stiff but not unkind acknowledgement of the vote's outcome. "I maintain my reservations, Miss Fernbrook," Lord Fenimore said. "Though I'll admit the council's overwhelming judgment carries weight I'm obligated to properly respect. I wish you both genuine success, whatever my personal caution continues to suggest." "Thank you, Lord Fenimore. I don't expect universal agreement, only fair consideration, which I believe this council has properly extended." He inclined his head, something almost approving in the gesture despite his continued reservation, and departed without further comment. Lady Varick approached them once the chamber had begun to properly disperse, her expression carrying something considerably warmer than the week's earlier tension had suggested possible. "Congratulations, Your Majesty, Miss Fernbrook." She inclined her head with formal, genuine respect. "I confess I remain somewhat cautious by nature regarding matters of this magnitude, but I find myself, watching today's proceedings, considerably more optimistic about this kingdom's future than I've felt in longer than I properly care to admit." "Thank you, Lady Varick," Tansy said, "for your honesty and your willingness to properly reconsider despite genuine historical concern. I'd rather admit uncertainty and reconsider properly than cling stubbornly to caution once genuine evidence suggests otherwise." Lady Varick's stern composure cracked into something almost like a smile. "Perhaps you'll teach this court that particular lesson considerably more thoroughly than my grandmother's cautionary history ever managed, Miss Fernbrook." She departed with brisk, formal efficiency, and Renfield, who had been watching the entire proceeding from his usual formal position near the chamber's edge, finally allowed himself a broad, genuine grin. "Well," he said, approaching them both, "I believe congratulations are properly in order, Your Majesty. Miss Fernbrook?" "Considerably overdue congratulations, Captain, given how thoroughly this week's proceedings tested everyone's patience. Worth every difficult moment, I'd wager, given the outcome." Renfield's usual stern composure carried genuine warmth. "I confess I'm rather looking forward to formal wedding preparations, if only to properly witness how your goat handles palace ceremony. Constable Biscuit will require considerable supervision," Tansy admitted, laughing despite the day's overwhelming emotion. "Though I suspect he'll simply treat the entire palace as an elaborate new territory requiring proper investigation." "Heaven help us all," Vesper said, though his voice carried nothing but genuine, warm amusement. Marchioness Aldwyn joined them last, her usual brisk efficiency softened considerably by visible, genuine pleasure at the outcome. "I'll begin formal wedding preparations immediately," she announced. "There's rather a great deal to properly arrange, given the scale such an occasion typically demands. Invitations to every territorial lord, formal seating arrangements that account for decades of delicate political rivalry, proper catering for a guest list that will likely number in the hundreds." "Please, Marchioness, nothing too elaborate," Tansy said, already half dreading the scope such preparations might assume. "I make no promises, Miss Fernbrook. This kingdom hasn't had proper cause for genuine celebration in considerable years. I intend to make the most of the opportunity. The Marchioness's expression turned suddenly considering. Though I confess I'll need your input on several matters only you can properly settle. Will your farm be represented at the ceremony? I understand Captain Renfield's mentioned certain animal participants. Duchess, at minimum, Tansy said firmly. Possibly Constable Biscuit as well, though I confess I have some reservations about how thoroughly a goat might disrupt formal ceremony. I've overseen considerably stranger requests in my years managing this household, Marchioness Aldwyn said dryly. I'm certain we'll manage a goat adequately, whatever chaos he threatens to introduce. Word of the council's decision spread through the palace and beyond with remarkable speed, and by the following morning, Tansy found herself the subject of considerably more public attention than the past week's careful, private deliberations had prepared her for. You're rather famous, apparently, Renfield informed her over breakfast, setting down a stack of broadsheets that had already begun circulating through the capital's streets. The Shepherd Queen. Several papers are calling you. There's already a rather popular ballad circulating about the drowning wolf and his rescuer, though I confess the poetic license taken with Constable Biscuit's role stretches credibility considerably. A ballad? Tansy stared at him in genuine horror. About me? About the entire remarkable story, yes. Village bards do love a good romantic tale, particularly one involving royalty and unlikely rescue. Renfield's stern expression cracked into visible amusement at her evident dismay. I'm told the goat features rather prominently in the third verse. Vesper, entering the breakfast room in time to catch this exchange, laughed outright at Tansy's mortified expression. I did warn you court life would prove considerably more public than farm solitude. You didn't warn me about ballads, Your Majesty. Ballads feel like an entirely separate, considerably more alarming category of public attention. I'll have Marchioness Aldwyn look into suppressing the worst of them, if it would ease your mind. Don't you dare, Tansy said, though a reluctant smile tugged at her mouth despite herself. If Constable Biscuit's going to be immortalized in popular song, I'd rather at least witness it properly, however mortifying the poetic license proves. That evening, with the day's formal proceedings finally concluded and the palace settling into quiet evening rhythm, Tansy found herself alone with Vesper in the same garden where Lady Varick's unexpected reconsideration had first properly begun. I keep thinking about what you told her, Vesper said quietly, watching the stars emerge over the palace grounds. That you'd return to your farm without resentment if the council rejected the match. I meant it, Vesper. Every word. I know you did. That's rather what makes it remarkable. He turned to study her properly, something raw and grateful in his golden eyes. I've spent considerable years surrounded by people who wanted things from my position, my crown, my authority. You're the first person I've properly loved who was equally prepared to walk away from all of it, rather than simply cling to whatever advantage proximity to power provided. I fell in love with you, Vesper, not your crown. I'd have loved you equally as a simple wolf who nearly drowned in my creek, crown or no crown. I know that now, entirely and completely. He took her hands, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles with the same tenderness he'd offered that very first morning she'd discovered him tangled in her second-best quilt. Thank you, Tansy, for loving the man rather than the throne, for facing that entire skeptical council with more grace and honesty than most seasoned diplomats manage, for pulling a drowning wolf out of Miller's Creek without any idea what remarkable chaos that single rescue would eventually bring to both our lives. I'd pull you out of that creek again, 1,000 times over, if it led here regardless, Tansy said softly, leaning into his embrace as the garden settled into peaceful, starlit quiet around them. Whatever formal ceremony and considerable chaos still waits ahead of us. Speaking of considerable chaos, Vesper said, something warm and teasing entering his voice despite the moment's tenderness. I believe Marchioness Aldwyn's already begun formal wedding preparations. I confess I'm rather terrified to learn what elaborate ceremony she's currently envisioning. Whatever it involves, I'm insisting Duchess attends properly. She's earned that much, given how thoroughly she started this entire remarkable chain of events by noticing you drowning in the first place. Vesper's laugh, warm and genuine, carried across the quiet garden, and Tansy, watching him properly relax into the evening's hard-won peace after a week of considerable political tension, found herself entirely certain that whatever formal ceremony and continued chaos still lay ahead, she'd face every single moment of it gladly, beside this particular king who'd first stumbled, quite literally, into her life through nothing more than a foolish, drowning wolf's desperate flight from danger. The letter arrived 3 weeks into wedding preparations, unremarkable in its plain sealing wax until Renfield's expression, reading it over Vesper's shoulder, shifted into something considerably darker than his usual composed bearing. "What is it?" Tansy asked. Looking up from the seating chart Marchioness Aldwyn had insisted she properly review. "Thistledown's son," Vesper said grimly, setting the letter down. "Corin Thistledown. He's requesting formal audience, claiming he wishes to properly address matters of family honor regarding his father's disgrace. Is that dangerous? Potentially. Corin was barely involved in his father's actual conspiracy, from what our investigation determined, mostly kept at the family's northern estate, away from the worst of the scheming. But grief and humiliation make people do foolish things, regardless of their previous innocence." Vesper rubbed a tired hand over his face. "I should grant the audience. Refusing it would look considerably worse than facing whatever grievance he intends to properly air. Then we'll face it together. Tansy." "I'm not asking permission, Vesper. I'm informing you of my intention." Corin Thistledown arrived 3 days later, considerably younger than Tansy had properly expected. Barely into his 20s, with none of his father's cold, calculating bearing, instead carrying himself with the particular raw, unpracticed grief of someone still processing genuine family catastrophe. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing with careful precision that nonetheless carried visible tremor. "Thank you for granting this audience. My father's crimes cost our family everything, our lands, our standing, our name's honor built over 4 generations. I spent weeks believing I hated you both, for the ruin that followed his defeat," Corin said. "But I've had considerable time since his formal sentencing to properly examine what actually happened. My father chose ambition over honor. Whatever cost that choice brought upon our family, it was his choice, not yours." "That's a remarkably generous conclusion, Lord Thistledown," Vesper said carefully. "I came here not to seek revenge, but to ask whether there's any path toward my family's eventual partial restoration. Not the lands my father forfeited, but simply a name no longer synonymous solely with treason." Vesper considered the request carefully. "I won't restore your father's title, but I'm willing to consider a path toward your own, separate standing, provided you're willing to earn it through genuine, demonstrated service rather than simple inherited claim. I'm willing to offer you a position within the Royal Guard, junior rank, earned through the same rigorous training every recruit undergoes regardless of birth." Corin's composed expression finally cracked, genuine emotion breaking through. "That's more generosity than I properly expected, Your Majesty. You're not your father, Lord Thistledown. I'd rather judge you by your own choices going forward." Corin departed an hour later, formally enlisted in the Royal Guard's junior ranks, and Renfield turned to Vesper with visible approval. "That was well handled, sire. I find myself these past weeks increasingly convinced that genuine mercy properly extended tends to produce considerably more loyalty than simple continued punishment ever manages." Vesper glanced at Tansy. "I believe I learned that lesson from watching you handle Lady Varric's own skepticism." News of Corin's enlistment spread through the palace within days. "You're certain this won't simply invite fresh scandal?" Lord Pemberton asked. "I spent 3 years being underestimated by an entire village, simply because I was young and alone," Tansy said. "I know something of being judged by circumstance rather than genuine character." "That's a fair comparison, Miss Fernbrook. I withdraw my concern, provisionally, pending how young Thistledown actually conducts himself going forward. It was Marchioness Aldwin, that same evening, who found Tansy reviewing formal correspondence with visible exhaustion. "You've handled this past week remarkably well," the Marchioness observed. "I don't feel remarkable, Marchioness. Mostly I feel exhausted, and occasionally rather terrified I'll say the wrong thing to the wrong person." That fear, properly managed, tends to produce considerably more careful judgment than false confidence ever does. "You'll need to properly approve the final guest list," the Marchioness announced one morning, presenting a scroll considerably longer than Tansy had expected. 312 confirmed attendees thus far. 312, Tansy repeated faintly. "I barely know 30 people, properly." Most attendees represent formal political obligation rather than personal acquaintance. Marchioness Aldwin's expression softened. "The ceremony itself will feel considerably more intimate than the guest list suggests once actually underway." The following days brought fittings, careful rehearsals, and an overwhelming succession of decisions Tansy had never once imagined a wedding might require. "I never properly understood," she admitted to Vesper one exhausted evening, "quite how much genuine labor goes into a single day's celebration. You needn't push through everything alone, Tansy. That's rather the entire point of genuine partnership." It was Renfield, unexpectedly, who suggested the compromise that finally eased Tansy's mounting anxiety. "You could hold a smaller private exchange of vows first," he proposed. "Something genuine and intimate, witnessed only by those who actually matter to you both personally." "Captain, that's a remarkably thoughtful suggestion. I've watched you these past weeks, working so hard to properly earn this court's respect. I thought perhaps you deserved one moment that belonged entirely to yourself and His Majesty." Vesper's response proved immediately and enthusiastically warm. "What would you think of holding that private exchange at Miller's Creek itself?" he asked. "The place where all of this remarkable chaos genuinely began." "You'd want that? Traveling all the way back to my hillside?" "I'd want nothing more. That creek, and your ridiculous, wonderful animals, and the particular quiet of that hillside where I first properly learned who you actually were." He took her hands. "Duchess will need proper invitation, obviously. Duchess will receive the most prominent invitation of the entire guest list. She discovered me drowning, after all." The private ceremony brought Tansy back to Miller's Creek for the first time in nearly 2 months. Constable Biscuit charging the gate, Sir Quacksworth's alarm quacking, Duchess wandering over with placid, unhurried welcome. "I've missed this place considerably more than I properly admitted," she told Vesper. "It won't replace this. I intend to ensure this farm remains properly ours, regardless of whatever formal capital duties otherwise claim our attention." The small ceremony itself, held at dusk with only Renfield, Marchioness Aldwin, and the neighboring farmer properly witnessing, carried a genuine intimacy the grander formal ceremony could never quite match. "I love you," Vesper said, their hands joined beneath the same darkening sky that had witnessed their very first chaotic morning together. Not the crown, not the political alliance, but simply, entirely you. The woman who pulled a drowning wolf from freezing water without any idea what remarkable chaos that single act of kindness would eventually bring. "I love you too," Tansy said, voice thick with emotion. "The king who couldn't properly fill a water trough, who let a goat eat his borrowed shirt sleeve without complaint." Duchess let out a long, satisfied bleat precisely as they exchanged their private vows. And Tansy, laughing through her happy tears, found herself entirely certain that whatever grand formal ceremony still awaited them at the capital, this quiet, chaotic, animal-filled moment would remain forever, the truest exchange of their entire remarkable courtship. Afterward, Constable Biscuit made one final memorable contribution by attempting to eat the corner of the small ceremonial cake, despite Tansy's assurances such confection wasn't strictly necessary. "He has no respect for ceremony whatsoever," Renfield observed, extracting the goat with long-practiced resignation. He has enormous respect for ceremony, Tansy corrected, laughing. He simply believes cake is an integral component of any proper celebration. Whatever formal grandeur the capital ceremony still holds in store for us, Vesper said, settling beside her with 2 rescued slices safely out of reach. I don't believe it could possibly improve upon this. No, Tansy agreed softly, watching her animals settle into contented evening rest around them. I don't believe it could. The morning of the formal wedding arrived clear and bright, spring sunshine breaking gold across the capital's grand towers in a way that struck Tansy, dressing with the assistance of a maid Marchioness Aldwyn had assigned specifically for the occasion, as considerably more overwhelming than her quiet private vows at Miller's Creek had been. You look magnificent, Your Majesty, the maid said, adjusting the final details of a gown considerably grander than anything Tansy had ever imagined wearing during her 3 solitary years of farm management. Not quite Your Majesty yet, Tansy said, though her voice carried genuine, nervous anticipation rather than correction. Though I suppose by this afternoon that particular title will finally prove accurate. Marchioness Aldwyn arrived moments later, her usual brisk efficiency softened considerably by visible, genuine emotion. The chamber's filling already, she reported. Every seat properly accounted for, 326 attendees confirmed in the end, and I confess I've never witnessed such genuine anticipation for a royal ceremony in all my considerable years overseeing them. That's either reassuring or considerably more alarming, Marchioness. Both, I'd wager, though I suspect, once you're actually standing before them, you'll find the nerves settle rather more quickly than you currently expect. Renfield found her in the final moments before the ceremony, formal in a way she'd never witnessed from the usually practical captain, his stern composure carrying something close to genuine emotion. You look every inch prepared for this, Miss Fernbrook. I don't feel prepared, Captain, if I'm entirely honest. Few people ever do, facing something this significant. I've watched considerable numbers of soldiers march into battle with less genuine courage than you've shown these past months, navigating a court that initially wanted nothing to do with you. He extended his arm with formal, careful gentleness. Might I have the honor of escorting you, given your own family's absence from today's proceedings? Something in Tansy's chest tightened at the thoughtful gesture. Old grief for her long-departed grandmother, mingling with genuine gratitude for the family she'd found instead these past months. I'd be honored, Renfield. Truly. The Great Hall, when they finally reached it, exceeded even Marchioness Aldwyn's earlier description. Banners in royal colors draping every visible surface, 300 formally dressed attendees filling row after row of seating, and at the chamber's center, waiting with visible, unguarded joy, stood Vesper. But it was a considerably smaller detail that made Tansy's breath catch properly as she began her formal procession down the aisle, near the front. Positioned with careful dignity beside Marchioness Aldwyn's own seat, sat Duchess, thoroughly scrubbed and adorned with a simple ribbon of royal blue around her neck, watching the proceedings with placid, unbothered satisfaction entirely unfitting for such formal grandeur. You brought her properly, she whispered to Vesper once she'd finally reached him, unable to fully suppress her delighted, disbelieving laugh. I promised she'd have pride of place, didn't I? I don't break promises, particularly not to sheep who've earned their standing so thoroughly. Constable Biscuit, thankfully, had been left in Renfield's careful custody somewhere considerably further from the formal proceedings, given his previous demonstrated appetite for ceremonial cake, though Sir Quacksworth, Tansy noticed with fresh amusement, had apparently been smuggled in as well, currently perched with considerable dignity atop a cushion near the front row, regarding the entire assembly with his usual judgmental air. The formal vows, once the ceremony properly began, carried a weight Tansy hadn't fully anticipated, despite having already exchanged private, genuine promises weeks earlier at Miller's Creek. The presiding elder's careful, formal language, the assembled court's rapt attention, and beneath it all, Vesper's steady, warm gaze holding hers throughout every formal word. "I, Vesper Nightshade," he said, voice carrying clearly across the hushed chamber, "take you, Tansy Fernbrook, as my wife and my queen, promising genuine partnership rather than simple obligation for whatever remains of my reign and my life." "I, Tansy Fernbrook," she echoed, voice steadier than she'd properly expected given her earlier nerves, "take you, Vesper Nightshade, as my husband and my king, promising the same genuine partnership, whatever chaos our combined life continues to bring." "I now pronounce you king and queen," the elder announced, and the great hall erupted into genuine, thunderous celebration as Vesper pulled her into a kiss that carried considerably more emotion than formal royal ceremony typically permitted, though Tansy suspected, given the assembled crowd's enthusiastic response, few present properly minded the breach of formal decorum. The reception that followed stretched long into the afternoon and evening, filled with dancing, formal toasts, and the particular warm chaos of celebration that Tansy found herself, despite months of careful preparation, genuinely and unreservedly enjoying, rather than simply enduring. Lady Varick found her during a rare lull in the festivities, her usual stern composure carrying genuine warmth. "Congratulations, Your Majesty. I confess I find myself considerably more optimistic about this kingdom's future than I've felt in longer than I properly care to admit." "Thank you, Lady Varick, for your honesty and your willingness to reconsider. Perhaps you'll teach this entire court that particular lesson considerably more thoroughly than my grandmother's cautionary history ever managed." Lady Varick's smile, small but genuine, carried real warmth. "I look forward to watching you try at any rate." Lord Pemberton offered his own formal congratulations shortly after, considerably warmer than his earlier skepticism had suggested likely. And even Lord Fenimore, still visibly cautious, extended proper courtesy that carried, beneath its formal restraint, something approaching genuine goodwill. Corin Thistledown, formally present in his junior guard uniform, found Tansy near the evening's later hours, something earnest and grateful in his young expression. "I wanted to properly thank you, Your Majesty, for advocating on my behalf, that first difficult audience. You earned your own path forward, Corin. I simply reminded everyone that character matters more than circumstance. I don't believe I'd have received that fair consideration without your example already established, honestly. Watching you face this entire skeptical court and win their genuine respect gave me courage I didn't properly know I still possessed." Something warm settled in Tansy's chest at the young man's genuine gratitude, old memory of her own uncertain beginning at this same court settling into something considerably more peaceful now that months of difficult, careful work had properly borne such genuine fruit. It was near midnight, the formal celebration finally winding toward its natural conclusion, that Vesper found her slipping away toward the same garden where so much of their courtship's most significant moments had already unfolded. "Escaping your own wedding celebration again, Your Majesty?" he asked, settling beside her on the familiar bench. "Simply seeking a quiet moment to properly appreciate everything today's meant, before the celebration fully claims what remains of the evening. May I join that quiet appreciation? Always." They sat together in comfortable silence, the distant sound of continued celebration carrying faintly across the garden, Duchess having been properly returned to more comfortable palace stables for the night, though Sir Quacksworth, Tansy noticed with fresh amusement, had apparently followed them out here as well, settling nearby with proprietary satisfaction. "I keep thinking," Vesper said softly, "about that very first morning. You screaming, Constable Biscuit putting a horn through your kitchen door, and somehow, from that chaotic, ridiculous beginning, we arrived precisely here. I still find myself amazed some days that something so significant grew from such an unlikely start. I've come to believe the unlikely beginning mattered rather less than what we chose to build from it, once given proper chance to grow." Vesper took her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Tansy. Considerably more today than even this morning, if such continued growth remains properly possible." "I love you too," she said simply, resting her head against his shoulder as the garden settled into peaceful, moonlit quiet around them. "Whatever remarkable, chaotic life continues unfolding from here, I find myself entirely ready to face it, properly, as your wife and your queen." Sir Quacksworth, apparently deciding the moment required proper punctuation, let out a single satisfied quack from his spot nearby, and Tansy, laughing softly at the duck's characteristically judgmental timing, found herself thinking that whatever formal grandeur this remarkable day had properly delivered, it was this quiet moment, her hand in Vesper's, an opinionated duck standing proprietary guard, and the whole overwhelming, wonderful chaos of the day finally settling into genuine, hard-won peace that would remain, forever, the truest and most treasured memory of everything Miller's Creek had ultimately given them both. "Ready to return to the celebration?" Vesper asked eventually, rising and offering his hand. "Ready," Tansy confirmed, taking it with genuine, unguarded joy. "Though I confess I intend to properly rescue Constable Biscuit from wherever Renfield's currently keeping him. He's earned his place at this celebration considerably more than most of tonight's formally invited guests." Vesper's answering laugh, warm and entirely genuine, carried them both back toward the Great Hall's continued celebration, and Tansy, walking beside her husband with Sir Quacksworth trailing loyally behind them both, found herself entirely, completely certain that whatever remarkable chaos still waited ahead, a kingdom to properly help govern, animals to properly manage across two considerably different homes, and an entire lifetime of genuine partnerships still unfolding before them, she wouldn't trade a single moment of the unlikely, wonderful path that had led her here, from a drowning wolf in Miller's Creek, to precisely this joyful, hard-won ending. Inside, the celebration had lost none of its earlier energy, musicians still playing and guests still dancing despite the late hour, and Constable Biscuit, successfully rescued from Renfield's stern custody and permitted, under close supervision, to properly rejoin the festivities, immediately set about investigating the abandoned dessert table with renewed enthusiasm. "He's going to cause a diplomatic incident," Marchioness Aldwyn observed, watching the goat's determined approach with visible, weary resignation. "He's going to cause several," Vesper corrected cheerfully. "I find myself entirely unbothered by the prospect, given how thoroughly this particular goat's already proven himself an asset to the Crown's continued survival." Widow Pruitt's village friends, a small delegation who'd traveled considerable distance specifically to witness the ceremony, found Tansy near the evening's final hours, tearful and delighted in equal measure at having properly witnessed the remarkable conclusion to a story they'd apparently been following with great enthusiasm through considerable second-hand gossip. "We knew from the very first rumor of a drowning king," one elderly woman informed her, dabbing at her eyes, "that something truly remarkable was properly unfolding. I'm so pleased we lived to see it properly concluded." "I'm grateful you came," Tansy said, genuinely moved. "It means considerably more than I can properly express, having familiar faces here among so much unfamiliar grandeur." As the night finally wound toward its natural close, Vesper drew Tansy aside one final time, something warm and settled in his expression that carried none of the day's earlier nervous anticipation. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Being properly, formally married, rather than simply privately promised?" "Considerably the same, honestly, though with rather more witnesses and considerably more cake than our private ceremony offered." Tansy smiled, leaning into his side. "I think I understood at Miller's Creek that the truest commitment had already been made. Today, simply let the rest of the kingdom properly witness what we already knew." "That's precisely how I feel as well." He pressed a final, gentle kiss to her temple as the last of the evening's music began winding down around them. "Welcome home, Tansy. Properly, completely, for whatever remarkable years await us both." "Welcome home," she echoed, watching Constable Biscuit finally get properly ejected from the dessert table amid Renfield's long-suffering sighs, Duchess presumably already asleep in her comfortable new stable, and Sir Quacksworth settling, with characteristic self-importance, into a place of honor near the celebration's final, winding-down edges. An entire chaotic, wonderful family, gathered together in genuine celebration of a love that had begun, quite improbably, with a drowning wolf and a shepherd's stubborn refusal to let anything foolish drown in her creek. Epilogue. 2 years later, the hillside farm at Miller's Creek had become something of a legend in its own right. Village children daring each other to properly approach the creek's edge, half convinced they might discover their own drowning royalty if they simply waited long enough. And travelers occasionally detouring considerable distance purely to witness the modest farmhouse where a king had once, quite famously, ended up tangled in someone's second-best quilt. Tansy and Vesper split their time carefully between the two homes, exactly as promised. Formal duties properly managed at the capital during the working week, but weekends and holidays reserved whenever possible, for the quiet hillside farm that had first brought them together. Constable Biscuit had been formally retired from active goat duty, his considerable age finally catching up with his once legendary energy, though he remained, by unanimous household decree, the farm's official royal guardian for life, spending his days dozing in sunny patches and occasionally head-butting unfamiliar visitors purely out of habit rather than any genuine remaining threat assessment. Duchess, remarkably, continued her placid, opinionated existence with no apparent intention of ever properly dying, having apparently decided old age was simply another circumstance to be weathered with characteristic, unbothered patience. She'd become something of a minor celebrity in her own right, several traveling bards having added additional verses to the popular ballad specifically honoring her role in the original rescue. Sir Quacksworth had, somewhat to everyone's surprise, taken up permanent residence at the capital's royal gardens, having apparently decided palace pond life suited his particular temperament rather better than farm life ever had, though he made the journey back to Miller's Creek each visit with visible, grumpy satisfaction at reuniting with his old territory. Lady Varick visited occasionally, her formal caution having gradually softened into genuine friendship, and Corin Thistledown had, through 2 years of demonstrated service, earned exactly the kind of quiet, separate standing Vesper had once promised. A small estate of his own, built entirely through merit rather than inherited privilege, his family name slowly, properly becoming associated with honest service rather than his father's old betrayal. Regrets? Vesper asked one quiet evening, the two of them settled on the same worn front step where so much of their courtship had first properly unfolded, watching the sunset paint the hills gold exactly as it had that very first remarkable week. Not a single one, Tansy said, leaning into his shoulder as Duchess wandered over to settle contentedly at their feet, Constable Biscuit already snoring nearby. Though I confess I never properly imagined, pulling a drowning wolf out of Miller's Creek, that I'd end up here, married to a king, with a goat holding official royal title, and considerably more chaos in my life than 3 quiet, solitary years ever properly prepared me for. Good chaos, I hope. The very best kind, Tansy said, smiling as the last golden light settled over her hillside farm. Exactly the kind worth pulling out of a creek and keeping properly, forever. If this story found its way into your heart, the drowning wolf, the stubborn goat's heroics, the king who fell in love between fence repairs and council chambers, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you. And if you're hungry for another tale of unlikely rescues and hard-won love, just say the word.